Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, November 10th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is November 15th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, it's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A, and we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. We develop our perspectives independently with a little help from the leadoff person, and then share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are all the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sara Mickelson.
Bill Hall.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton, and our leadoff for the day is our friend Sara Mickelson. How are you today?
Better than I deserve. All right, so we're still in Matthew. It's still Year A for a couple more weeks. And we're looking at Matthew 25, and we're looking at the middle section. So Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. And last week we talked about the lamp carriers, the women who were waiting for the bridegroom, the 5 that brought extra oil, and the 5 that had to go shopping at the last minute for oil. And so we're going to continue that conversation, and this follows right on the feet of that story, or as it were. So starting with verse 14. For it is as if a man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To the first he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his ability. And then he went away. The one who had received 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents, and see, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed me over 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And then the one who had received 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you do not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and I hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But the master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I do not sow, and I gather where I do not scatter. Then you ought to have invested my money with bankers, and upon my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For all of those who have will be given, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. And thus ends the reading of our scripture. Ooh. So there are a couple of paths through this. I'm hoping that we can look for what are the nuggets of gold that we can take with us. Charles, do you have anything to offer at this point?
Well, I did. We talked about the possibility of looking at other passages that are grouped with this one, the gospel passage, to look at the other the letters and in the Old Testament, and I did that. The only one that struck me as making a real connection, but it actually made a connection with the last week's passage, was the passage from Thessalonians, where in Thessalonians 5, 1 through 11, beginning of the 6th verse. So then, well, I'll go back up. But you, beloved, are not in darkness for that day to surprise you like a thief. You are all children of light and children of day. We are not in the night or the darkness. So then let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who are drunk, get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for the helmet, the hope of salvation. That's the closest connection that is obvious from my own reading of the other texts that are provided for consideration on this coming Sunday.
Thank you. So in looking at this passage this week, we have a sister conversation that takes place on Monday with the followers of the way. And they may take a very different path through this story than we did, or than we will. But this week, I thought about this particular passage, and the words that came to my thoughts were the gifts of God for the people of God. And I think the intent of these gifts might have something to do with how the behavior of the slaves or those given the talents responded. So here's my first question. What is a talent in this story, and what might a talent mean in today's terms? And then my next follow-up question that goes with this is it only a wage, or could the talent be something else? So I'm going to start with Bill Hull, because I'm sure he's got something prepared.
Thank you. Welcome, Charles, Don, Sarah, and those listening later. The Greek word here is talenton, so you can see why we translate it talent. That's sort of a direct connection with the original Greek. I went to a resource, Arndt and Gingrich, their Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, and they note that originally talent was a measure of weight, according to Arndt and Gingrich, varying in size from 58 to 80 pounds. Something else I discerned from them is in different regions, the word might mean something different. In other words, there was not a universal use. So originally it was a measure of weight. Then it was a unit of coinage whose value differed considerably in various times and places, but was always comparatively high. I think on the followers of the way, John said that one talent was equivalent to 15 years' wages, something like that. And, of course, its value depended on the metal from which it was made, or not just metal. It could be gold, silver, copper, ceramic, or whatever. In the Cultural Background Study Bible that I looked at, there are some scholars who question this story, saying that would never have happened, that people listening to Jesus wouldn't have believed it because that never happened. According to this study Bible, that was not an uncommon thing for especially somebody with great wealth and many probably lands in many different places. According to this resource, that was not unusual to entrust significant amount of money to be managed while the owner was away. Now, for me, as I've said before, it's always helpful to read somebody who agrees with you. But I came across Caroline Lewis's article on this entitled Entrustment. And I'm going to read the first couple of lines and then some selected others. This is how she begins this interpretation of this parable. It is really rather simple. What are you doing with what you have been given? She says that's the point. It's simple, clear. She goes on to say, to be honest, sorting out the minutia of the meaning of talents in this parable is less interesting to me than the fact that Jesus calls out our squandering of that which has been entrusted to us. That phrase caught my the squandering of that which has been entrusted to us. It means believing that God meant it when God called you. Entrustment is the very gift itself. Now, part of why I resonate with that is that's how I was raised to understand this parable. I can remember ministers and Sunday school teachers saying to this little kid and others, you are God's child. You are here for a reason. You have abilities. You haven't discovered them all yet. We never do. But you have been gifted, and it doesn't matter how much or how little you have. It matters what you do with it. So, I was shaped by that interpretation in my childhood. And one of the issues in this story is the clear harshness. I noted last week there's kind of an escalation in these parables. One was the door is locked and outer darkness, and next week's parable will end up that harshness is clear. I don't have a struggle with it because I think this is an accurate picture of human sociology or human life, that the temptation is to play it safe. You think of yourself as a parent. You got a child who's very bright but won't apply himself or herself. Now, is your frustration with that unloving? At least in my case, both personally and professionally as a pastor, the frustration comes from love. You have abilities, and you're not applying them. You're not developing this talent. Or if we're in a work situation and a fellow worker is not doing his or her part. One thing I like about this team is, and I mentioned this in our separate conversation, all of us work hard at this. We work differently, but I wouldn't want to be on a team where I felt like somebody is just taking up a seat or coasting. So my point is that what we hear as harshness, I think, is reality. What music teachers used to say, use it or lose it. You can not miss music, any talent, if you don't keep using it. And the other thing was a mantra I came to early in my ministry, and my staff used to laugh somewhat like others of my friends laugh when I refer to the book of James. It's like, oh, here goes Bill again with his little spiel. My spiel was, there is no such thing as risk-free ministry. If it's risk-free, it is not ministry. Now, that's not, let's go do stupid things. And I've got a story to share a little later that illustrates that. There are risks in ministry, and one risk is the third person. And by the way, for what it's worth, and I'll finish with this story in essence is told in Luke 19. There are 10 servants called, and I'm not absolutely sure from how it's worded in Greek, but it would appear that each of them was given one talent. He summoned 10 of his slaves and gave them 10 pounds. So I infer from that. And then there are only 3 that report, and one, let's see, the first one made 10 pounds, the second one made 5, and the third one buried it. But it's interesting in Luke's telling that each of the 10 get the same amount, unless I'm misunderstanding the Greek there. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Bill. Lots to think about. Don, do you want to offer anything up?
Sure. I think knowing what estate or household you live in is a blessing, and I think that's part of the message here. You know who you are, who you're with. I'm not commenting on slavery. I'm commenting on the message of understanding the mission, the household, the estate. And I think that's the first assumption we're asked to make here. Where are you? Now, there's other readings here challenge that. But for this first step, I'm going to go, all right, who are you? What are you working towards? So I think that's a part of it. And also being asked to meditate on where you are. What is your mission? What is your state? What are your abilities? Can be very challenging. So I would offer up about 4 weeks ago, and Jesus holds a coin and says, give to Caesar what is Caesar. And my reading of that is everybody goes, you're asking us to parse what this coin is supposed to go to? What? And they're confronted with the fact that this is creation. This is God's creation. All is under that household and that estate. So as that starting point, that helps me plug in the interpretation that I'm working with today. If you set that aside, by the way, there's another way to go. So the house and the state, you know where you are, and it's in today's 21st century language, I think you're looking for, Sarah, is we would call this the universe. If you're reading graphic novels or comic books, or they would say, what's that universe? What are the rules of the universe? You have to be in the universe to understand it. So I'll overlay that. I would say on the job, the greatest blessings when you have a task to do is understanding where you are. And 21st century language, you prompted this, Sarah, is, well, I'm in the groove. It's like I feel so connected to mission and customer if you're working on a job. And if you haven't had that blessing in your life, I pray that you will have that. And I have had not enough of it because it just, use 21st century language, I'm stoked, right? It's great. And sometimes it's for just a day. You finish a task and you're like, wow, it was intuitive. I was working and everything I had was happening, and I could measure the success. And the people of the estate, the company, the household, the family, it doesn't matter what it is, go, we feel it, we see it, it's real. And sometimes it can last for months. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'm here to testify it can last for a year or two. And I think that's what's here, that there's that joy, that can you tap into that joy, and I think that's what it is. So I think the coin, the talent, which is a static thing, is only alive if you have that connectivity. Final note on that is for 21st century, it's an exploration, not just in trust, but in, forgive the technical language, it's like operationalizing talent. You don't do it by giving orders. You trust, you allow for creativity. You understand that each human being has their own field of vision, and what can happen from that sometimes is astonishing when you dare to let that happen, and that there's this relationship of the individual to that engagement and that feedback that really matters. It is, I think joy works for that really well, but my starting point is you have to identify first what is the estate we're dealing with. I want to turn that on its head in just a minute, but that's my 21st century connection, Sarah.
Thank you, Don. Charles, do you want to offer anything? You're muted.
Maybe that was trying to tell me something. Words don't say it. So this is unpolished, but it seems to me. Well, here's where my mind went. What the slaves did, who were given the 5 talents and the 2 and the 1. What the first 2 did was exactly what Jesus is telling people. Not Jesus. What the Old Testament is telling us in terms of our rules of life is that you don't charge interest. So what these 2 slaves did, they went out and did exactly what our scripture's been telling us all along. Don't do that. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who get rewarded. The other one who, actually, he doesn't do it right either. Because what he does is he buries it. So he makes it as though it's not worth anything. I wonder what would have happened, and this is where the mess becomes. I wonder what would have happened if the slave who had been given 1 talent had gone and had shared it with those who had none. divided them up among them, and they had come back, returning to him great gifts. So he had returned to his master then the gifts that he had received as he had used the talent he had been given for good, and maybe he would have been the one who would have been rewarded, whereas those who went out and gave him the interest that they had earned, they had been punished for violating the commandment. Now, I'm not going to push that any further. I'm simply dropping that in the middle, and I'm going to stop, turning the mute button on.
Thank you, Charles. I'm of two minds with this. Don, I really liked your language around how we respond when given opportunities, gifts, or when we are entrusted with something. Speaks to who we are and how we operate. What do we hold as pillars of activity or pillars of behavior? And, I would call it as what is your work ethic, so to speak. So one of the phrases that comes to my mind is be fired with enthusiasm, or be fired with enthusiasm. So I'm thinking of because you were neither hot nor cold, I spit you out of my mouth, which is a passage from later in the conversation that will be had in Revelation. So I think there was something to be said for, I think you're right that how you respond to what you're entrusted with speaks or points to the relationship you have with the giver. And that has something to do with the question that's coming in a few minutes. But I think when it comes to what a talent is and what it could be, I think that it is whatever you're entrusted with. It could be money. I think that entangles the human mind a little bit. You can step away from that lasso or that leash and think of it as something much grander, something bigger, whether it's a good work opportunity and something that that captures your heart and your commitment. Don, I'm like you. I've had the benefit of working on a particular opportunity where the mission was so in tune with what I loved that it became a joy to do the work. And I will say that once you've had that experience, you seek out more experiences like that. And everything else is a sorry substitute when you don't have that. So I'm going to qualify that I think that speaks volumes about how you feel about doing the work you're doing. I don't know that it's just a wage. So my second question gives some voice to that. Since the talents, and in parentheses I put a lifetime of opportunity, a lifetime of good engagement, or just simply wages, times 1, 2, or 5, that since the talents truly belong to the giver and are gifted or surrendered to each receiver, what does this parable tell us about the relationship between the giver and the receiver, or each receiver? Don, I'm coming to you first.
Yeah, it was a really interesting question, and I think that this giving and this delight or joy that you have in it is meant to be a reflection of the coming Christian journey, that we are foreshadowing something here. And it might have gone with the followers of Jesus on their first walks and their first journeys, that they're already in that slot. They're already thinking, they're already working that way, or expecting that joy, because each assignment may be different, each community they may visit. So I think there's a foreshadowing there. I think also it's important to think about, as the master gives, the owner gives, and Matthew is just filled with owners and masters, and always right there. Don't forget that master has 10,000 talents. Not like it's almost like when you read it, it's like the talents all of a sudden appear in the hands of the slaves. Like, no, talents are here, right? And maybe there's another master of many estates. I mean, so you want to break the analogy a bit. Maybe there's 10,000 talents up here above your head, and it's showering the talents, and they're taking off, and they're replicating, and they're growing, and along with it, the joy grows. So it's not a static thing because it doesn't exist without the human being touching it. That they go together, and the human being isn't filled with joy and purpose unless they touch the talent. So bearing it is, I would say, an analogy for death, a grave. I'm going to take that at its literary face value. You're killing the world. You're killing your neighbor. It's all the way down. We can talk about the why and the motivation, but he puts it in the ground, and the master makes it very clear that in the ground it's not the value that it actually is. The analogy he gives is it's worth something more already because you don't touch it. Like, you devalued this. It's not static. It actually becomes lesser. It's like, well, you're going to bury something. You're going to put something under your mattress. You have $100 today and $100 tomorrow. This says no. That $100 is actually less than what it should be. And I think that's an analogy about you are less. You're not thinking. You're not because it's buried. His mind is in a hole. He cannot see his neighbor. He cannot operationalize it using the current language. And I think that's really important in that relationship. For the construction of this, it's easier for us to read than it could be, because even though we bristle at slavery, I think the point is to say, let's go ahead and assume everybody's already in an estate. This is to say it's God's world, and there's no question about where the talent should go. Give to God what is God. All things are God. So it starts there. It makes it easier for us. It gets harder as we apply the world to it, where, well, who are you working with? It raises the real question of what is your estate. It goes back to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, when all things are God's. I go to work. I may be humming, but for what purpose? I do things for the interest of my family. Is it for the purpose? What is it, your words, Sarah, what is the ethic of each of these things? The world I'm living is much more in pieces than this one. This makes it easy for us to deal with, but this is in many, many pieces. And what I want to do is, I think if you're leading a class or reading commentators, there is a way to turn it on its head without breaking it, which is if the talent is more than the weight of the coin, and that it's only real when you touch it and use it, and you are only full when you use that to its fullest. If that's the case, if you meditate on the estate, it may be that the talent is that I do quit my job. The talent may be that I'm a conscientious objector. The talent may be that I'm arrested for a protest. There is a flip of this that still keeps the idea of what universe are you working in. And, a few hours ago even, I was worried because it was such an extreme view where you're caught in a system and do you cooperate or not. This is a system of master and slaves. What do? You say no. I think this is more a meditation on who are you, and who are you when you're activated by this kind of special wealth that God's put on the wealth for you to use. So there is a reading that works with this, which is I use the talents by standing down. And, if you've ever, in a small or large way, stood down from something and said no, I would throw out that that's the talent being operationalized as well. Sarah?
Thank you, Don. Thoughtful. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Bill, what do you have?
I think what I'm going to share springboards from what you were saying, Don, if I understood you correctly. You think about it. A slave in that time was of little status. They were owned by somebody else. So to use our modern day phrase, it was counterintuitive to entrust a person of such low status with wealth. And I wonder if, we can't know this for sure, if Jesus wanted us to go, you know what? I'm somewhat in that same position. You know, who am I? I will tell you, I've shared before, and I'll briefly allude to it. When I first when I embraced Christ on my own and committed myself, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And then I began to feel a nudge to be a minister. I said, wait a minute, accept that, Lord. I truly believe I was incapable of that. I genuinely believe that. And it was because I had known ministers who were so eloquent and kind and effective. And here I am, this freshman in college whose head is spinning, whose world is in some ways turned upside down, and I'm trying to navigate my way through all that. For me, I can, at least in my fantasy, identify with the slave. You want me to do what? I can't do that. So for me, that's a part of it. And I like your question. I probably spent more time on this than the other two, although all three were good. What is the relationship between the giver and each receiver? And I think that's the crux of this story, is how do I view the one giving me these gifts? Richard Rohr writes at one point about this parable, history is continually graced, I like that phrase, history is continually graced with people who have been transformed and somehow learned to act beyond and outside their self-interest for the good of the world. People who clearly operated by a power larger than their own. Again, something from somewhere, someone else. They are exemplars of public virtue. And he adds, this story can be understood as advocating perseverance and courage. Now, the other thing that came to my mind was my favorite passage to preach on. The churches I serve, we did a lot of this gift discovering. You know, there are various curriculums that help you. What are your gifts? And 1 Corinthians 12, and I'll just read some of the phrases. Variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. Variety of services, but the same Lord. Variety of activities, the same God. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For the common good. To one, wisdom, another, utterance of knowledge, gifts of healing, prophecy, miracles, discernment, tongues, interpretation of tongues. It did get me to musing who among us has the gift of tongues and who on this team is interpretation. I don't have either of those gifts, but we can speculate on that later. And then the final verse, 11, all these are activated by one and the same Spirit who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. I think that passage in 1 Corinthians 12 is, in a sense, a commentary on this parable. It's activated by the same Spirit. There's one God, and to each individually as the Spirit chooses. That's what I have for the moment.
I really like that. Thank you, Bill. Charles, do you want to put anything in the mix? You're muted.
Yeah, I know there was a reason I was muted. I should keep my mouth shut, so I'm going to do that this time.
Oh, and we're worse for it. So,
well, all right then. I'll make the observations I was going to make. I have the sense that we are overpowering a parable. A parable is to make a single point. And I was looking again at the text, and the thing that leaped out to me was that the man, it says he entrusted the property to them. He didn't give it to them. He entrusted it to them. So he was, in effect, saying, take care of this on my behalf while I'm gone. And then he also said, he gave so one got 5, and one got 2, and one got 1, to each according to his ability. So the master already knew what his servants, his slaves, were capable of doing. He trusted them. And the problem was that the one who buried it, I don't think that was what the master trusted him to do. The master trusted him to do something else. The last comment I wanted to make was that in our thinking about how well these slaves did and how they did exactly what they should have done, they went out and invested the money. What if they'd been on a down market instead of an up market? What if they'd come back and the one to whom he had given 5 talents said, well, I invested it just like I thought you would, and lo and behold, the market went down. So here 4. And the other one said, yeah, I went out and invested my 2 just like I knew you would, and the market went down, so here's 1. And here's the one who then buried the one and said, well, I was careful. And so here's your 1. Who did better at that point? And the problem is that we shouldn't be doing things like what I just did. We shouldn't be trying to make something out of a parable that it's not making. The parable is, in fact, saying the master trusted each of these people, and the 2 of them followed through, and the 1 didn't. I can mute myself again.
And that's one of the reasons I asked the question about what do we believe the talent is. Because if I look at it as a number of years' worth of wages or a lifetime of wages, that equates to a lifetime of opportunity, a lifetime of engagement, a lifetime of enterprise. And that struck me as a way of perceiving this and seeing it as I've been entrusted to engage in the world. I've been entrusted to move forward as a representation or representative of the person I've received these or that I've been entrusted by. So my father's favorite phrase was, remember who you are and whose you are, and do everything as if you are representing who you belong to. And that has ruled and given me boundaries and constraints about how I speak to people, how I behave, how I interact, but also the kind of work I want to do and the kind of activity that I pursue. And the method by which I do that work. So that's driven a lot of decision making on my part. When it comes to the relationship between the giver and the receiver knows what I'm capable of, and I understand the mission, and I can activate what I'm entrusted with, or I can be fearful of what I'm entrusted with. And fearful about what I'm entrusted with. And I think that is a driving factor for humanity is if fear is what drives you, it drives differently than if love is what drives you. And I think, Bill, in pointing to the Spirit moves me in such a way to step outward with open hands. If I give the fear an opportunity to speak to me, I'm less likely to walk out with open hands. I'm less likely to walk out. And I will say how I feel about risk and what I'm risking may rule my engagement. So I'm giving some voice to a lot of the language that filled my head this week. And how do we mitigate fear? I mean, the number one thing God says on a repetitive basis to humanity is fear not. I mean, just about everybody that comes in contact with humanity as the Christ emerges says, fear not. So I'm enchanted by that, and I'm wondering how we mitigate that in a world where fear seems to be a present and palpable presence. So that was something that I thought about, the receiver and the giver and the relationship between the pair. Is if fear is a driving factor of that relationship, then there's already a problem. So question number 3. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. Faithfulness seems to be a player in the story, a multiplier, if you will. So how does faithfulness work in this story for you, and how does the receiver of one talent demonstrate, or not, faithfulness? Bill, you want to take a shot?
Yes, thank you. Again, a question that I spent some time on. I think it is about faithfulness. And I forgot to note where I copied this from Scripture. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and power forever and ever. Amen. If one of you right offhand remembers where that's from, I somehow was drawn to that scripture and didn't note the reference. There again, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has. That's faithfulness. And I think it is possible to hear the harsh judgment in this story, not as a final rejection, but as a rhetorical device to make clear how urgently essential Jesus' message is. Now, what I want to focus on, in one of the articles I read in Christian Century, it directed me to a story I had not heard. Some of you may be familiar with it. Apparently it got a good bit of publicity. The LaSalle Street Church in Chicago, Illinois, is apparently by some measures, a somewhat small church. They sold a piece of property that they had and made a great deal of money. And through a process, I think at the pastor's leadership, they decided to take a good portion of the money and give everyone in the church $500 with no strings attached to use it for ministry. Now, maybe I didn't look in the right places. I wasn't able to find a follow-up story, but I did find press stories about when that was done. And the pastor, at least then, may still be, is a Laura Truax, Truax. And she was quoted as saying, the point is not the money, it is the risk. I like that. The point is not the money, the point is the miss. The master wasn't worried about the money, she said in this parable. He was worried about whether the servants were going to take a risk, whether they are going to do business. Do you think that we didn't wake up in the middle of the night and think, we, the session and leaders, that we might be wasting this money? Are we sure that's what God calls us to do? And then she says there's no fine print here. This is her sermon when the checks are in the fellowship hall. You just walk over there and get the check. We are behind in our own budget. We are doing this because this is what it feels like to do business with God, risky and crazy and vulnerable and incredibly threatening and exciting at the same time. Crazy, risky, vulnerable, threatening, exciting at the same time. So for me, and I'll close with this, we can hear the forcefulness of this story, wince and seek ways to tame the parable or reframe it to fit our comfort zones, or we can hear the strength and urgency of Jesus' words as an invitation to enter into the risks and the joys of creative and courageous ministry. And my last comment, we are at a time in this nation when that is what we most need. Creative risk-taking, reaching across somehow walls that are built. There is an urgency for us individually and as Christians and as a nation and as a world to take the kind of risks that build bridges rather than walls.
Amen. Don?
I'll pick up on what you're saying in the United States today, and I think I can do this without taking sides or being political. I think risk-taking requires a new scorecard, and the scorecard maybe have not been understood in terms of the talent. What is it when it's meant to do? How do you know? The master defined what it's supposed to do. But I am sensing, because of what I do for a living, a willingness to engage in new ways of measuring. What is the talent? How do we as a people engage? For instance, if you're going to invest in bridges and highways, rebuild the country in certain ways, that the scorecard might not be how much asphalt you pour, or how many potholes you fix, or how many bridges, but how many people get to work, how many people can get to the hospital, how many people can get to curriculum, broadband deployment. I'm not being political here. I'm saying there's another angle. And I think this is about what angle you look at things on. Or Emily Dickinson would say, what is the slant that you've been taking? Let's look at it another way. And I think the scorecard itself speaks to talent, that it may be more human and more far-reaching. Imagine one allocation out of Congress saying this is supposed to impact justice, equity, education, talent, infrastructure all together, which is really normal. You just have to wake up. Right? It's a wake up. It's an arrival, right? To use other languages of gospel. Something's happening, something's changing, and we can participate in that. Or we can choose to go on about our way and bury the talent as if nothing's changed, as if that's the way it has to be. So it's looking at something with new eyes. I just wanted to, that's just, Bill, you got me excited when you raised those things. To directly respond, I do think it's important to see this as an exercise in faithfulness and interpretation of faithfulness and loyalty in a broken world. And that way we can rescue this slave. He made the decision, Sarah, like you said, based on fear. He's making judgments. There's a hopelessness in it. There's a terrible hopelessness in it. Risk overwhelms him. It's not a matter of, balancing risk and opportunity as an entrepreneur might. He's overwhelmed by this. So this is a parable residing in a broken world, which goes back to the master who does a horrible thing, the slave that was not faithful. What is faithfulness in this broken world? I don't know that I particularly like all the aspects in a broken world faithfulness, because this slave is not punished individually. He is punished for us to see. He's punished for other slaves to see. All right? This is a way of doing business that I do not accept as a Christian. So I want to highlight, and so I read this as being, in today's world, in a broken world, we are overwhelmed by fear, judgment, risk, hopelessness, nihilism, not being ready. And we do shut down. So I'm looking back at the master. That's not God. Who is this? So I think it's a meditation on what faithfulness really looks like and what that joy of being engaged really looks like as well, because this slave is punished for all of us to see. To what end that I see this punishment? Fear? I think fear is being entrenched again in this one as well. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Don. I have a story to share that's an education story. And it's a wonderful illustration of what happens when a creative teacher meets an opportunity. So this educator took her small group of kids, there were about, 15 kids, into the hallway at a school. And a lot of times in schools, hallways are long. And they have multiple classrooms, if you will, opening from the hallways. And she said to each of the students, and they were broken into small teams of 3 or 4, she said, I need you in the next 30 minutes I'm going to ask you to bring your pencils and your paper out with you. I would like you to tell me how long this hallway is. And the kids objected because they didn't have a measuring device like a tape measure or a ruler. And she goes, I didn't tell you you had to use a unit of measure that we have as a standard. I need you to just tell me how long this hallway is. Go. And she left them alone. And group one came back and they reported that this hallway is 2,383 pencils long. And the next group reported that the hallway was actually 45 bobbies long, because they'd laid Bobby head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, all the way down the hallway. And the third group reported that they counted ceiling tiles, and it said, this is 225 ceiling tiles long. So I think one of the challenges we have that this story truly illustrates is we may not all use the same unit of measure, but we're all asked to measure the hallway. And we're all asked to come to some definition of what the hallway or this lifetime is about. And I think that I love this educator's perspective because she removed from them those, if you will, safe units of measure and engaged or activated the in this case they happen to be, I think, 8-year-olds, units of measure. What a unit of measure is going to be like. And ask them to come to some judgment about how long the hallway was. And there was really no wrong answer as long as they activated the task. And they came back with some description of how long the hallway was. So I think that maybe this is a really good illustration of what it means to actively engage, what it means to come to terms with the gifts that were given, the lifetime or the talents or the wealth or just, red hair for that matter. So what do we do with that, and how do we deploy that? And maybe how do we reflect who we work for? So that was part of my perspective through the story. I agree that the person who's given one talent seems to be constricted by fear or constricted by anticipated punishment. And I wonder, how do we coax those people into the joy of their master? How do we activate them to come and play? Because I think that's what this is really about, is how do we turn the page so that all are engaged and all are activated and all are a participant in the joy of their master. Charles, do you have anything more to offer?
Yes. I've been thinking and puzzling about this passage. And here's my question. What if the slave who had gotten £1 had gone out and had noticed the widow putting her 2 mites into the collection plate and recognized that that was the last she had and gave her his £1 and reported that to the master? What would the master have said? I mean, that's of course the problem with parables. You can't fiddle with them like that. The parable is the parable, and it says what it says, not something that you make up and add to it. But that's my contribution.
Thanks. Well, I see we're really out of time. That's too bad because I'm ready. And if you're listening in, we hope you're now ready to start. That's the sense I take from these. Now let's begin. And many of you are facilitating classes, preparing sermons, going to manage a Sunday school class. That's our job, I think, just to get readier every time that we're together. And if you're listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And at that site, especially during pandemic, there are other resources, discussions of this same passage, different opinions, different interpretations, wonderful sermons, great music, prayer, and reflection. So we commend that site to you. And you are always welcome, and we'll see you next time.